The Riley family had been a fixture in the small town of Greenville, South Carolina, for generations. The current head of the family, 45-year-old Cameron Riley, was a self-made man who had built a successful business from the ground up. Starting with a single auto repair shop, he had expanded his empire to include multiple locations across the state. Known for his strong work ethic and dedication to his family, Cameron was respected by his employees and admired by his peers in the business community. However, in the summer of 2015, Cameron's life took a tragic turn. While out for a weekend ride on his beloved Harley-Davidson motorcycle, he was involved in a devastating accident. A drunk driver, later identified as 28-year-old Marcus Thompson, ran a red light at a busy intersection and collided with Cameron's bike. The impact sent Cameron flying onto the pavement, where he lay motionless until paramedics arrived on the scene. Cameron was rushed to Greenville Memorial Hospital, where doctors worked tirelessly to save his life. He had suffered a shattered spine, multiple fractures, and extensive internal injuries. After several hours of emergency surgery, Cameron was stabilized but remained in critical condition. His family, including his wife Ariana and son Jason, kept a constant vigil at his bedside. It became clear that Cameron's injuries were more severe than initially thought. Despite multiple surgeries and intensive rehabilitation, he showed no signs of regaining sensation or movement below his waist. The doctors delivered the devastating news. Cameron would likely never walk again. He would be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life, dependent on others for his daily needs. The news hit the Riley family hard. Cameron, once an active and vibrant man, struggled to come to terms with his new reality. He fell into a deep depression, withdrawing from his loved ones and lashing out in anger at his circumstances. Ariana, his devoted wife, found herself in the challenging position of caregiver. The 32-year-old who had immigrated to the United States from Mexico as a teenager had met Cameron while working as a receptionist at one of his auto shops. Despite their 13-year age gap, the two had fallen in love and married after a whirlwind romance. Now, Ariana was forced to put her own dreams and aspirations on hold to care for her husband full-time. She quit her job and spent her days tending to Cameron's every need, from feeding and bathing him to managing his medication and physical therapy appointments. Jason, Cameron's 19-year-old son from a previous marriage, also struggled to adjust to the new family dynamic. He had been living with Cameron and Ariana since his mother passed away from cancer when he was 15. While he had always had a somewhat strained relationship with his father, who had high expectations for his future, Jason still loved and respected him. Seeing Cameron so vulnerable and dependent was a shock to the young man. Cameron's frustration with his limitations often manifested as verbal abuse towards Ariana and Jason. He would lash out at them over minor incidents, blaming them for his condition and accusing them of not doing enough to help him. Ariana, exhausted from her caregiving duties and feeling trapped in a situation she never asked for, started to resent her husband. She found herself longing for the freedom and independence she had once enjoyed. Jason, caught in the middle of his father and stepmother's growing tension, was torn between his loyalty to Cameron and his sympathy for Ariana. He could see the toll that the situation was taking on both of them, but felt powerless to do anything about it. As he watched the two people he loved most in the world drift further apart, Jason couldn't help but wonder if his family would ever be the same again. As the year 2016 progressed, Ariana and Jason found themselves drawn to each other in the midst of their family's struggles. Ariana, a former professional dancer, had given up her career to marry Cameron and move to the United States. She had always dreamed of opening her own dance studio, but had put those aspirations aside to focus on her role as a wife and stepmother. With Cameron now requiring constant care, Ariana had little time for herself. She felt isolated and unfulfilled, longing for a creative outlet. That's when she discovered that Jason, a college student at the University of South Carolina, had a hidden talent for dance. Ariana offered to give him private lessons in salsa, hoping to reignite her own passion for the art form. Jason, who had been struggling to find his place in the world, jumped at the opportunity. He had always been interested in dance, but had never had the confidence to pursue it. With Ariana's guidance, he quickly discovered a natural ability and a love for the rhythm and movement of salsa. As they spent hours together practicing in the family's living room, Ariana and Jason began to open up to each other in ways they never had before. They talked about their hopes and dreams, their fears and frustrations. Ariana confided in Jason about the challenges of being a caregiver and the toll it was taking on her mental health. Jason, in turn, shared his own struggles with his father's expectations and his uncertainty about his future. Their conversations often turned to Cameron and the impact his accident had on their lives. Ariana expressed her growing resentment towards her husband, who she felt had become demanding and ungrateful. She complained about his constant need for attention and his lack of appreciation for her sacrifices. Jason, too, spoke of his father's overbearing nature and his frustration with Cameron's attempts to control every aspect of his life. As they danced and talked, Ariana and Jason found solace in each other's company. They looked forward to their lessons as a break from the stress and tension of their daily lives. Slowly but surely, their friendship began to evolve into something deeper. They started to feel a mutual attraction, a spark that neither of them had experienced before. At first, they tried to ignore their growing feelings, knowing that acting on them would be a betrayal of their family. Ariana was still married to Cameron, and Jason was his stepson. They knew that any romantic involvement would be seen as a violation of trust and a moral transgression. They started to find excuses to spend more time together, lingering after their dance lessons to talk and laugh. They began to exchange furtive glances and accidental touches, each one electric with unspoken desire. Meanwhile, Cameron remained largely oblivious to the growing bond between his wife and son. Confined to his wheelchair and consumed by his own pain and frustration, he had become increasingly withdrawn from his family. He spent most of his days in front of the television, rarely engaging with Ariana or Jason beyond demanding their assistance. As Ariana and Jason's relationship deepened, Cameron started to feel like an outsider in his own home. He sensed a change in the atmosphere, a shift in the dynamic between his wife and son. But he couldn't quite put his finger on what was happening. He assumed that they were simply growing closer as a result of the challenges they faced together. By the beginning of 2017, the relationship between Ariana and Jason had escalated into a full-blown affair. Unable to resist their growing attraction, they began to meet secretly at a motel on the outskirts of Greenville. The Bluebird Inn, a rundown establishment off the interstate, became their regular rendezvous point. Ariana would tell Cameron that she had to work late or run errands, while Jason would make excuses about studying with friends or attending campus events. In reality, they were stealing moments of passion in the dingy motel room, consumed by their forbidden love. Their encounters were intense and emotionally charged. Ariana, starved for affection and physical intimacy, found in Jason a lover who worshipped her body and soul. Jason, eager to please and desperate for connection, saw in Ariana a woman who understood and appreciated him in ways his father never had. As they lay tangled in the sheets, Ariana and Jason would pour out their hearts to each other. They talked about their dreams of escaping Greenville and starting a new life together, far away from the obligations and expectations that weighed them down. They fantasized about running away to Mexico, where Ariana still had family, and opening a dance studio on the beach. But even as they indulged in their romantic visions, Ariana and Jason were haunted by the guilt of their betrayal. They knew that what they were doing was wrong, that they were hurting Cameron and risking the stability of their family. They tried to justify their actions by telling themselves that they deserved to be happy, that Cameron's accident had changed everything, and that they had no choice but to follow their hearts. However, the weight of their secret began to take its toll. Ariana became increasingly distant and distracted at home, often lost in thought and quick to snap at Cameron's demands. She started to neglect her caregiving duties, leaving Cameron to fend for himself for hours at a time. Jason, too, struggled to maintain the facade of normalcy. He became withdrawn and moody, skipping classes and avoiding his friends. He started to drink heavily, using alcohol to numb the pain of his guilt and confusion. Cameron, meanwhile, began to suspect that something was amiss. He noticed Ariana's frequent absences and her growing coldness towards him. He saw the way she and Jason would exchange knowing glances and secret smiles when they thought he wasn't looking. At first, Cameron tried to dismiss his suspicions as paranoia. He couldn't imagine that his wife and son would betray him in such a way. He told himself that Ariana was simply stressed from her caregiving duties and that Jason was just going through a phase. He started to pay closer attention to Ariana's movements, noting the discrepancies in her stories and the odd hours she kept. He even tried to confront her about his concerns, but she brushed him off with excuses and reassurances. In April 2017, Cameron's suspicions about Ariana and Jason's behavior reached a boiling point. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more than just a close friendship between his wife and son. He began to notice the subtle signs of their growing intimacy, the way they would exchange loaded glances and find excuses to touch each other. At first, Cameron tried to rationalize their behavior. He told himself that he was just being paranoid, that the stress of his condition was making him see things that weren't there. But as the days passed, the evidence became harder to ignore. He caught Ariana and Jason in a series of lies about their whereabouts. They would claim to be going to the gym together or running errands, but their stories wouldn't quite add up. Cameron would find receipts for places they hadn't mentioned, or overhear them whispering about plans they hadn't shared with him. The tension in the Riley household reached a breaking point. Cameron's frustration with his own helplessness and his growing suspicions about Ariana and Jason's relationship made him lash out at them in anger. He would accuse them of neglecting him, of treating him like a burden rather than a husband and father. Ariana and Jason, for their part, became increasingly defensive and evasive. They would dismiss Cameron's concerns as unfounded, telling him that he was imagining things. They would insist that their relationship was purely platonic, that they were just trying to support each other through a difficult time. But Cameron knew better. He could see the guilt in their eyes, the way they would flinch when he questioned them too closely. He knew that there was something they weren't telling him, something that they were desperately trying to hide. Desperate for answers, Cameron hired a private detective to follow Ariana. He instructed the detective to track her movements, to document her comings and goings, and to report back to him with any evidence of wrongdoing. For weeks, the detective tailed Ariana, watching her every move. He followed her to the Bluebird Inn, where she would meet Jason for their clandestine trysts. He photographed them together, capturing the intimate moments they shared behind closed doors. When the detective presented Cameron with the evidence of Ariana and Jason's affair, he was devastated. He had suspected that Ariana was cheating on him, but he had never imagined that she would do so with his own son. The betrayal was too much to bear. Cameron confronted Ariana and Jason with the photographs, demanding an explanation. At first, they tried to deny it, claiming that the detective had fabricated the evidence. But as Cameron pressed them, they eventually broke down and confessed to the affair. Ariana pleaded with Cameron to forgive her, insisting that she had never meant to hurt him. She told him that she had been lonely and unhappy in their marriage, that Jason had been a source of comfort and support when she had needed it most. Jason, too, begged for his father's understanding. He told Cameron that he had never intended to fall in love with Ariana, that their relationship had started as a friendship and had only recently turned romantic. He swore that he would end the affair and never see Ariana again. But Cameron was too angry and too proud to accept their apologies. He felt betrayed and humiliated, his trust in the two people he loved most in the world shattered beyond repair. He told Ariana and Jason that he would never forgive them, that he would make them pay for what they had done. In the weeks that followed, Cameron's anger and despair consumed him. He became increasingly unstable, prone to violent outbursts and fits of rage. He would spend hours brooding in his wheelchair, plotting his revenge against Ariana and Jason. Ariana and Jason, meanwhile, continued to see each other in secret. They knew that they were playing with fire, that their affair could only end in tragedy, but they couldn't resist the pull of their forbidden love, the passion that burned between them like a flame. In May 2017, during one of their secret meetings at the Bluebird Inn, Ariana and Jason made a fateful decision. They agreed that the only way they could be together was to eliminate Cameron from the picture. They convinced themselves that it was the only solution, that they had no other choice if they wanted to be free to love each other. Ariana was terrified of losing her social standing and financial security if she were to divorce Cameron. She knew that her husband had built a successful business and had amassed a considerable fortune. She feared that if she left him, she would be left with nothing, forced to start over in a foreign country with no money and no prospects. Jason, too, had his own motivations for wanting his father gone. He had always resented Cameron's overbearing nature and his constant attempts to control his life. He saw his father's accident as an opportunity to break free from his influence and start a new life with Ariana. He dreamed of inheriting his father's millions and using the money to build a future with the woman he loved. Together, Ariana and Jason began to plan Cameron's murder. They knew that they had to make it look like a suicide, to avoid suspicion and protect their own reputations. They scoured the internet for information on how to stage a convincing suicide scene, studying the methods and materials they would need to pull it off. They decided to use Cameron's own gun, a .38 caliber revolver that he kept in his bedside drawer. They knew that Cameron had been struggling with depression and chronic pain since his accident, and they believed that a self-inflicted gunshot wound would be a plausible way for him to end his suffering. Over the course of several weeks, Ariana and Jason carefully planned every detail of the murder. They discussed how they would get Cameron alone, how they would position his body to make it look like he had shot himself, and how they would dispose of any incriminating evidence. They even went so far as to write a fake suicide note, using Cameron's own words and handwriting to make it look authentic. In the note, they had Cameron express his despair over his condition and his belief that he was a burden to his family. They hoped that the note would be enough to convince the authorities that Cameron had taken his own life. They convinced themselves that they were doing what was necessary, that they were acting out of love and self-preservation. On the night of June 15, 2017, Ariana and Jason put their plan into action. They waited until Cameron was asleep, sedated by the painkillers he took to manage his chronic pain. Then, they crept into his bedroom, gun in hand, ready to do what needed to be done. They had thought that killing Cameron would solve all their problems, that they would be free to start a new life together without fear or guilt. The morning of June 17, 2017, started like any other in the quiet town of Greenville. But as the sun rose over the Riley family home, a gruesome discovery shattered the peace and tranquility of the community. Cameron Riley, the once successful businessman and devoted father, was found dead in his study, a single gunshot wound to the head. The scene was initially treated as a suicide. Cameron's body was found slumped over his desk, his own .38 caliber revolver lying next to his hand. The police, who had been called to the scene by a distraught Ariana, saw no immediate signs of foul play. They assumed that Cameron, who had been struggling with depression and chronic pain since his accident, had finally succumbed to his despair. Detectives uncovered a series of suspicious details that suggested that Cameron's death was not as straightforward as it seemed. They discovered that Cameron had a large life insurance policy, worth millions of dollars, that named Ariana as the sole beneficiary. They also found a recently updated will that left the bulk of Cameron's estate to his wife, with only a small portion set aside for his son Jason. The most damning evidence, however, came from Cameron's neighbors. Several people reported hearing a loud argument coming from the Riley home the night before Cameron's death. They described raised voices and sounds of a struggle, followed by a single gunshot. When questioned by the police, Ariana and Jason initially denied any knowledge of the argument, claiming that they had been asleep at the time. But as the pressure mounted, their stories began to unravel. The private detective that Cameron had hired to follow Ariana came forward with evidence of her affair with Jason, including photographs and audio recordings of their clandestine meetings. The cremation of Cameron's body, which had been arranged by Ariana just hours after his death, also raised red flags. The police began to suspect that the crime scene had been staged to look like a suicide, and that Ariana and Jason were the prime suspects. In the face of the mounting evidence, Ariana and Jason's alliance began to crumble. Jason, who had always been the more emotionally fragile of the two, cracked under the strain of the investigation. In a desperate attempt to save himself, he agreed to testify against Ariana, portraying her as the mastermind behind the murder plot. In his testimony, Jason claimed that Ariana had been the one to suggest killing Cameron, and that she had pressured him into going along with the plan. He described how they had rehearsed the murder for weeks, planning every detail down to the fake suicide note and the positioning of Cameron's body. He even admitted to being the one to pull the trigger, claiming that Ariana had threatened to leave him if he didn't go through with it. Ariana, for her part, maintained her innocence throughout the trial. She claimed that Jason was lying to protect himself, and that she had no knowledge of the murder plot. She portrayed herself as a victim of circumstance, a woman who had been trapped in a loveless marriage and had turned to Jason for comfort and support. But the jury was not convinced by her defense. In January 2018, after a highly publicized trial that captured the attention of the entire country, Ariana and Jason were both found guilty of Cameron's murder. Ariana was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Jason received a 25-year sentence with the possibility of parole after 15 years. In the wake of their convictions, Ariana and Jason Riley were sent to separate prisons to serve out their sentences. Due to the high-profile nature of their case and the severity of their crimes, they were both placed in maximum security facilities, designed to hold the most dangerous and notorious offenders. Ariana, who had been sentenced to life without parole, was sent to the Camille Griffin Graham Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. The prison, which houses the state's female death row inmates, is known for its harsh conditions and strict security measures. Ariana was placed in a solitary confinement cell, where she would spend 23 hours a day locked away from the rest of the prison population. The isolation and the reality of her situation quickly began to take their toll on Ariana. She fell into a deep depression, haunted by the memories of her past and the knowledge that she would never again be free. She refused to eat or speak to anyone, and her health began to deteriorate rapidly. The prison staff were forced to place her on suicide watch, fearing that she would try to take her own life. Jason, meanwhile, was sent to the Kirkland Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. The prison, which houses some of the state's most violent and dangerous male offenders, is notorious for its gang activity and its high rates of violence and sexual assault. Jason, who had always been physically slight and emotionally vulnerable, was an easy target for the other inmates. From the moment he arrived at Kirkland, Jason was subjected to constant harassment and abuse. He was beaten, robbed, who saw him as a weak and easy mark. He quickly learned to keep his head down and to avoid drawing attention to himself, but the constant fear and trauma began to eat away at his sanity.